This episode is proudly supported by Anchor Food Professionals. Whether you're a caterer, cafe operator, or chef running a commercial kitchen, everyone knows quality products are the foundation of successful dishes. Anchor Food Professionals is a trusted supplier to the hospitality industry and has built a stellar reputation thanks to their consistently excellent butter, cream, and cheese. As the food service business of Fonterra, Anchor Food Professionals is home to many well-known brands such as Perfect Italiano, Mainland, Western Star, and Bega, and is now an important part of the Australian food service sector. Anchor Food Professionals has a history of innovation and expertise in sustainable dairying that delivers a world-class product portfolio. If quality cheese, cream, and butter are important to your creations, head to anchorfp.com.au to explore the range.
I'd like to acknowledge Australia's First Nation people as the traditional custodians of the land, and for this episode in particular, the Murra-Ira-Mina people of the Oyster Bay Nation. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging.
Enthusiasm, enthusiasm and enthusiasm. I think if people come and, they're prepared to work hard and they love what they do and they're prepared to, judge and get involved, I love enthusiastic people.
This is Over a Glass. I'm Shanteh Wale.
Michael Hill-Smith was the first Australian to become a Master of Wine. Since that time, in 1988, he hasn't slowed the pace in any way, shape or form. He is the co-founder of Shaw & Smith, Tolpuddle and the MMAD Vineyard, and one of Australia's most prominent and earth-shaking wine figures. He joins me today to tell me what's new and exciting in the world of Michael Hill-Smith. Hi, Michael. Thanks for joining me.
Shanteh, nice to be with you.
Well, this has been a long time coming, and it's always such a thrill to have a chat with you. You are a very busy man, and to name all of your accomplishments would be such a hard task. When did the wine bug bite you?
Well, I was born into a wine family. I was born into the Yalumba dynasty, and I was slightly ashamed about that in a way, because you'd think after 6 generations you'd find something else to do, but apparently not. So no, I was brought up at Yalumba at Angaston, and was very involved in wine. I mean, when we were a kid, the rumble of the grape deliveries through vintage, the smell of freshly squeezed grapes, all that, that was, and the winery was our playpen, to be perfectly honest. So I got brought up in that, but I always struggled slightly with the dynastical nature of it. And I liked wine, but I didn't like the idea of necessarily going into the family business. But I was very lucky. Len Evans had quite a large effect on my life. I met him, I think, when I was 5 years old, maybe. And, he always took a lot of interest in me. And so I found that, Len's wine life, which was very different, at least, to the wine life that I thought that I might have at Angaston in the Barossa, was very, very interesting. So I was very lucky, really, to come across Len, who really encouraged me to, to judge, to study, to do Master of Wine, or all those things at that time.
Amazing. I mean, how did your family feel about that? Were they disappointed that you didn't want to step straight into kind of taking over the family business?
Look, my dad was quite clever, really. He kind of knew that I wanted to open a restaurant, which in fact we did in the end. But he said, why don't you just come back and, you can work, you can learn a bit more about restaurants before you commit to doing your own. And so because I'm basically an enthusiast, I just really enjoyed being part of, the family wine company at that stage. With my cousin Robert. But then, I don't know, I thought there was a bit more to it, a bit more to potentially my wine life than that. And then I kind of dreamt up this idea of doing a Master of Wine, and, I was the canary in the coal mine. I was the first that they allowed on the program. And, it was just a wonderful challenge and a wonderful time. driven by a reasonable amount of naivety, to be perfectly honest. I had no idea that the pass rate was less than 10%. Had absolutely no idea. And I suddenly found myself in London with my wife, Stacey, and I'm going, bloody hell, what have we done here? I honestly didn't realise what I'd signed up for. Anyway, it all worked out well in the end, and it set me on a different pathway.
I mean, I can understand, hearing about this amazing program and thinking, yeah, I think I should go and do that. But it was a very different time back then. These days people decide, I think I want to give the MW a go. How do I do that? Let me get in touch with somebody that's a Master of Wine and ask them, what did you do when you went about deciding to do that? What was Australia like in the 1980s, and who did you turn to for advice?
Look, I was very, first of all, I was quite sneaky about it because I had, I realised, we'd met a number of people, Jancis, Michael Broadbent, the great Michael Broadbent, who ran Sotheby's, and a number of other Masters of Wine over time. And then a group of Masters of Wine came to Australia in 1983, and that was really the beginning of wine exports to the UK. It was a golden time for Australian exports. So I suppose I'd had a bit to do with Masters of Wine, and I was walking down St James's in London, and I walked into a bottle shop, and the head of the institute was there, and I said, when are you bastards ever going to let people that are not UK wine trade or British into this little club of yours? And he said, actually, we were just talking about it last week. So I went off, sat both parts of my diploma, I think 4 months or something, and luckily that was a bit easier in those days, and managed to pass it. And then I wrote off, and they said if I came to the UK, lived in the UK for 2 years, they would then allow me to sit the exam at the end of that time. So it was one of those, I don't know, we're just, when you're that age, you're full of confidence.
Well, that's for sure. Now, being an Australian and walking into, the UK market, did you feel like a fish out of water? Did you notice a big change in what, your assumptions and your learnings in Australian wine was compared to, your colleagues in UK?
Absolutely. I had, I think I was fairly wine literate for myself at that time. I was judging. I'd been to Roseworthy. I'd hung out with Len and all of, as an unpaid waiter at his dinners. So I knew a bit. But when I got there, they were extremely welcoming. I was a bit of a curio, I have to say, but they were going, oh, yes, that's the Australian. That's the Australian. So there was a bit of that going on. But people were very kind. And interestingly, the first person who rang and said, we're so pleased that you're here, would you like to come over for dinner, was Jancis Robinson. So people were extraordinarily kind and welcoming. And it opened me up to a whole world of wine other than, a fairly rigid approach to judging wine and appreciating wine, which we do in Australia. So I found it very, very interesting. And I think was probably the most valuable few years of my life.
What we wouldn't give to have a tiny skerrick of that experience back in those days with those incredible people. Tell me, within the MW process, we know that there's, it's broken down into segments. Was there an area that you found more difficult than others, or did you find it all just a breeze?
Nope. The people who, first of all, I don't think anyone sails through. The people who tend to do better than most are people who are like super bright, like people like Jasper Morris, who went to Oxford, Jancis, double first in maths, people like this, seriously bright. And I might be enthusiastic, but I'm not bright. So I found it quite difficult. And in those days, I actually found the technical stuff all fine because we'd played so much options over all my life. I was actually not bad at picking wines blind and doing that logic. So I think I was fairly strong in that space. But interestingly, writing academically in an MW Oxbridge kind of a way, I found, difficult. And one of my tutors actually said, "So do you get away with this in real life?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Just saying something emphatically and people believing you." And I went, "Yeah." So I found the academic rigor, was probably the most challenging.
I have to say, still to this day, I have experiences when I come across people from Cambridge or Oxford, and they're so incredibly, well educated, and just the way they speak can kind of stop you in your tracks and think, "Good gracious, what am I doing with my life?"
Yes, but can they taste?
Well, that's another thing entirely, isn't it? Now, you've just come off the back of Len Evans' tutorial, which has just finished up. Would look like an amazing week. I'd love to know if you could kind of sum up perhaps Len Evans and his character or his personality. Do you have a story that really kind of is cemented in your brain that kind of can help describe him?
Look, Len was pugnacious, competitive, massive ego, massive polymath, and just for a small man, he absolutely commanded the room. And, his contribution in terms of, getting young judges, encouraging them to talk about wine, speak about wine, judge wine. I mean, he was extraordinary. And, but, he was tough. He was tough. Not everyone loved Glenn because, he was a very large character. But I remember being a waiter at a single bottle club at the Lodge, and Malcolm Fraser was Prime Minister, and there was a few of us that were, dragged along to open the wines, and quite clearly they didn't have their own staff. So anyway, it was very good fun. And I just always thought that if you were from another planet and you walked in and said, "Who is the leader of the free world, or at least of this country?" Evans was the most comfortable person in that room, in addition to far more than Fraser. So, Len was a large character, and his legacy, which shows very much in the Len Evans tutorial, is extraordinary.
Tell me a little bit about when you passed your MW. What was that feeling like, and what world opened up to you when you returned to Australia?
Look, I think when I passed, you would think it would be elation, but it wasn't. It was relief. And most MWs I speak to, because it is a, it's like doing a marathon and doing another marathon and then going back for a third time. It's tough. It is a tough program. So I came back. I think I was extraordinarily pleased with myself. I think
as you should be.
No. I mean that in a negative way. I think I was very pumped up by my own importance. But no, it was good because I had left Yalumba at that stage. And the fact is, it is quite difficult when you come. I mean, this sounds ridiculous, but when you do come from a winemaking family, sometimes it's hard to distance yourself, from one's history. So what it meant was that when we set up Shaw and Smith and later, the Tolpuddle and other things, I think everyone saw me as having as being separate from a wine dynasty and more importantly, my own person. It was very helpful. I think it got me through the door in an awful lot of people. Gave me some authority. It was a very good thing for me. It was a big gamble that paid off.
Well, it sure did, and to do it and drag your wife along to live in the UK and to survive all that is incredibly impressive. Now, I do get a lot of young winemakers and sommeliers occasionally dropping me a line saying, I'd really like to get into LET and I'd like to do some wine judging. Now, for all those people that are out there thinking that, can you talk to me about why wine show judging is important for Australia? As somebody who is the current joint of chair for Decanter World Wine Awards in the UK, tell me a little bit about why wine show judging is important in Australia.
Good question. If you go way back, it is, the improvement of the breed. They always used to say, how can you breed a better cow? How can you make a better cheese? How can you make better wine? And that's why they were always done through the Royal Agricultural or the agricultural shows. So initially, it was about improving quality. It was only then when the likes of Wolf Blass came along and won his multiple Jimmy Watsons that he popularised it in a way that it made it more about the consumer. But the initial wine show feeling wasn't about awarding medals to sell wine. It was about making better wine. So I think that continues today. Once again, it's almost sacrilege, I think, to say, well, do I really mind, who's won those trophies? Well, of course I do. I think it's very important. It's important for the producers. But as someone who's judged wine since 1980, and I'm sure you would agree because, you also judge around the camaraderie between judges, the ability to learn more by rubbing shoulders, with the old and the bold and the young and the talented, is almost the best part of being involved. So if anyone's a young wine professional, it's a really good thing to do because everyone can say something about wine. Yes, it's got a lovely colour. It's got, it smells like this or that, or, people do that in their wine tasting notes. But when you're actually having to rate quality and you're actually having to really make a decision about, of these 5 wines in front of me or the 20 wines in front of me, which is the best wine and why? And, there's no fence sitting there. It makes you commit. And I think that people who judge do become better wine people as a result of doing that.
I totally agree with you. And I think, when you have to, like you said, it is quite quick paced and you have to make a judgment in a short period of time, and you can only rely on your own senses to do that. And I think the more judging you do, the better you get at making those decisions quickly and knowing they're the right decisions.
Yes, and the quality of wine judging in Australia is infinitely better than in most other countries that I've judged in. To be honest, I think the Australian judging system, it's tough. It's tough. And as a result, the people that come out of it, I think it sharpens your palate in a really positive way.
Fantastic. I'd love to know a little bit about, someone once said to me, and I think this is a great quote, so I had to write it down. Someone said, if you're going to make a decision about something that you need to do as in a business, if you ask yourself, what would Shaw and Smith do? When that's probably the right answer. And I have heard that from a few different people, and that was a broad stroke of a kind of quote, but they meant it in any decision in any business, anything to do with wine. What does Shaw and Smith, would they do? Then that's what you probably should do, which I think is the highest compliment. So what I'd like to know is, how do you keep such talented people in the mix of Shaw and Smith? Because when you look around, I feel like they're all being snapped up and you just have this incredible group of people all working under the Shaw and Smith umbrella. How do you do that?
Well, I think, first of all, we've always tried to make the best possible wine we can. I know that sounds, he would say that, but, we're right from the beginning, and that goes back to Len Evans. Len was always sort of saying, Australia makes good wine, but we should be making great wine. So he always was that bit of the gravel in the shoe. So I think we always realised that, talent is really important. And I suppose, first of all, I was lucky. Martin Shaw is a very talented winemaker and, very hardworking and, really over all the detail. And so I think the original, Michael and Martin combination worked really well because we're very different people, like massively different people. And in a way we complement each other. So I think that was the first thing. There was two of us, not one of us. And then I think as we kept on going, we realised that, if you want to keep anything sharp and relevant, you just need to surround yourself with the best possible talent you can. Sometimes I've said, we're like a aging rock band and, we need to go and find the best new guitarist we can. And there's, there's a bit of that. So when we, it was probably, 15 years or so ago, I realised needed some help. So I went and my first choice was David Lemire, another master of wine. And, David's really sharp and really cares about wine and loves selling it, but loves wine even more. So he's terrific. And then when, we were looking for a winemaker to help Martin, instead of just going and finding an assistant, we said, let's go and find the best winemaker we can in Australia at the moment. Adam Wadowitz came across our bow. So we've always tried to recruit the best and, might sound a bit self-important, but we do try and create a little Camelot here in the Adelaide Hills where we attract really good people.
Well, I've heard from multiple people that work for Shaw and Smith, and they are always complimentary at the fact that there is always learning to be done and that it is a workplace that encourages you to be the best version of yourself. And I think that that's an incredibly empowering character to have in your business. And, I can't compliment you enough.
Well, it's good. I've just turned 70. I can't believe it. I feel about 8 sometimes. But anyway, coming to work is really good because we've just got bright, challenging people who are kind of wanting to make the best wine they can, and there's lots of open debate. There's lots of discussion, and it's really, I'd say fun, but it's not really fun. It's really a satisfying place to be. And we're lucky. A few of our projects have worked well. Tolpuddle in particular, more recently, has been a lucky serendipity in that project, and it continues to give us a lot of joy.
That's for sure. Now, the Melbourne Royal Wine Show was on recently, and some Tolpuddle wines emerged out of the gold medals, which didn't surprise me in any way. Tell me a little bit about what's happening with Tolpuddle and the story of how Tolpuddle came about.
Well, Martin. It's almost counterintuitive because one of the reasons why I think Shaw and Smith has been successful is that Martin and I haven't been lured to other projects, other things, other regions. We've tried to sort of focus on Adelaide Hills and what we do here. And that was all well and good until we went to Tasmania in 2011 just for a look. I think we just wanted to have lunch. We had had dinner with Andrew Pirri and a couple of other people, and we just kind of wanted to learn a bit more about what was happening in Tasmania. Tasted some wine out of barrel, at Bay of Fires. Wines we loved all came from this vineyard called Tolpuddle that we'd never heard of. Within a day, we'd kind of gone there, worked out that Tony Jordan was involved in the planting of it, and Tony was a mate. So we kind of called in, had a look, and really bizarrely, in a way, we both drove out of the gate of Tolpuddle, turned to each other, Martin and I, and said, we have to buy this, even though it wasn't on the market at the time. So it was sort of bizarre, really. And, I say 3 weeks later, but it wasn't. It was probably more like 3 months later. We had an overdraft vineyard and no real clear idea about what we were going to do with it. But we had it. And then what began was, 10 years of constant improvement of that vineyard. And the wines are very distinctive, as those wines from southern Tasmania are. And I think, right wine, right time. People were very supportive of it. The wines have done fantastically well. I think we've got, 800 people on our waiting list at the moment for, to buy. So it has been a terrific project. Really, really, really fun.
It is an amazing site, and I don't know if I've ever said this before, but I've definitely told people. But when my first visit to Tolpuddle, I just thought, my goodness, if you want to look at an immaculate vineyard, this is it. And I looked down and there was this incredible clover patch, and I picked up the biggest four-leaf clover I've ever found. And I thought, there's just going to be something about this place that's going to feature in my life. And I literally look forward to when the Tolpuddle wines cross my desk every year. It's a moment where I know I'm going to feel tingles and remember why I love this industry so much. And I do feel that way. What's next for Tolpuddle?
Well, at the moment, I think we've now reached the stage where the whole vineyard is up to the standard that we want it to be, because we probably didn't do our due diligence back in 2011. There was bits of the vineyard that were stronger than others, and, it's taken 10 years of, doing lots of things, from, changing, the foliage wires to how we prune to, getting rid of some of the clonal material we didn't like, replanting part of it, et cetera, et cetera. But come sort of, I think it's December the 6th or 7th, we actually open a tasting room down there, which will be good. You could ask, why the hell are you opening a tasting room when you've got 800 people waiting on your waiting list? And it's actually quite a good question.
It is a good question.
I'm not sure I know the answer. No, I think I do. I think the ability to be able to actually be in the vineyard, and this is true of any of the great sites that you visit, and it's any of the great producers that you visit, when you're actually in their vineyard, in their cellar, tasting their wines in situ, it just builds a link to that wine, to that vineyard that doesn't exist by just reading about it or drinking a glass of it. So I'm hoping that people will come to Tolpuddle. I mean, it's only 24 people. People will have to book and whatever, but we hope that people will sit in there. And the original idea is they're going to taste a current vintage Chardonnay and an older vintage Chardonnay, and a current vintage Pinot and an older vintage Pinot. That'll be the standard offering. And, they can sit there and, see what happens, what the current vintage is like, and, what happens when you age these wines. I think it's going to be a really positive addition to the Tolpuddle story.
I think so too, and I think it's wonderful to have a place where people can come and like you said, whether or not they have access to the wines or not, there's a lot of people out there that aren't necessarily in the know and don't know winemakers, and they want to have the experience, and I think it's really great to have a place where they can come do that. I, wouldn't be surprised if you were selling stubby holders or something, because I thought, well, we all drink beer anyway, so we could all just come and buy a Tolpuddle stubby holder, drink a beer, and then look out at this beautiful vineyard. That sounds quite nice to me as well. I'll take that on notice, And also, talking about talent, once again, we worked out who the hell do we want to run this? Because, running, we don't live in Tasmania, and Pip Anderson, who was food and beverage director at Mona,
and once again, a quite accomplished judge and ex-sommelier. She's come on board and she's running it. So once again, I feel quite relieved that we've actually got a grown-up down there running the show.
You couldn't be in better hands than with Pip. So I think that is, once again, you have snapped up the hottest talent for yourselves. And I think it's a very, very smart choice. Now, tell me, Michael, we are in a kind of unusual place in the economy at the moment, and also where Australian wine is sitting. In the time that you've been involved in wine, I'm sure you've seen many ebbs and flows. How are you feeling about the future of Australian wine at the moment?
I'm feeling, if I'm simply looking at what we're producing and what's in the glass, I'm really upbeat. I think that we've never made better wine. There's more regional differentiation than before. There's more overall diversity than before. And we saw it at Len Evans last week or the week before, where, the top Australian Chardonnays, Pinots, Shirazes and Cabernets were amongst the very best in the world in those blind tastings. They just look fantastic. So in wine quality terms, I'm feeling really good. In terms of the market, I think there is, some quite strong headwinds at the moment. Obviously, there are overproduction issues for the industry in total, but if you're talking about fine wine, which is obviously more my area, the things that sort of makes me exciting, I just don't think we've done a good enough job at prosecuting how fabulous top Australian wines are internationally, and COVID hasn't helped, and there's a whole lot of reasons, but I just feel, if I look back 20 years, I would have hoped that we would have made more headway in terms of people understanding what Australian fine wine is all about internationally.
And that's an interesting one too, for the fact that, is that, how do we do that? Is that getting the right people and moving them like chess pieces, into different parts of the world? Is it the access to social media that helps us? I mean, how we do that it's a big question mark.
Yeah, I reckon. I think the way of the communication may change in terms of, there's obviously social media and other ways of doing it, but I'm old school. I reckon you just got to hop on a plane and you've just got to show as many influential people as possible the best wines that we produce in Australia, and we need to be relentless in that. And whilst we might want Wine Australia or some of the governing bodies or the industry bodies to do that on our behalf, and they've done that to a better or lesser degree over the years, in the end, it's a question of kind of working out who do you want to speak to, arriving in London, arriving in Hong Kong, arriving in New York or wherever, and, showing people the best of what we do. And I do that a lot, and I do that a lot not just with our wines. I regularly would do tastings of, 10, 15 of the most exciting wines in Australia at the moment, whatever they might be. I think that that's what we have to do. We just have to continue to open bottles and show them, to people and try and share our excitement.
Yeah. And I think, the kind of Sharon Smith masterclasses that you put on are so fantastic. When you do all the wines blind, you pop a couple of your wines in, you put other wonderful Australian examples in with Burgundy, with America. I love that because I feel that you let your real blind palate do all the work and no preconceptions based on brand. And I think it's really, eye-opening for the person sitting there, for the person that's put the wines together. So I think that model is bloody fantastic, and I wish more people would have the bravery to do that with their own wines. You said you turned 70, which is kind of shooketh me, because I wouldn't have thought you were close.
If you feel shaken, imagine how I feel.
I'm still recovering from that. But when you kind of look back, you've got many, many moons to go. But what would you like your legacy to be in the Australian wine industry? Sorry, not in just general in life. Just
Look, I think my legacy. I don't think it can be. I don't think you can sort of list things like saying Australia's first master of wine or whatever. I think they are nice achievements. They're good achievements. But I think on balance, I think that I've really loved everything to do with my wine life. I just find wine exciting. I find, if we could find. Anyone could have as much enjoyment from their time as producing, tasting, judging, and just meeting all the wonderful people that are part of the wine industry. So I think that I'd like to think I was sort of an enabler in a way. I'd like to think that I might not be the sharpest, wine judge in the country, but I'm kind of good at. I'm quite good at it, and I try and encourage, and get good people around to be involved in it. I love the fact that we've got people working for us at Shaw and Smith and Tolpuddle, and I love to think that that we've sort of enabled them to be better people, better wine people, and contribute. So, yeah, I think it's more of a, benevolent chess master.
I like that. You need to put that on some kind of badge.
Well, it sounds better than being manipulative and Machiavellian.
Exactly. So do you think there's still room out there for people that speak emphatically, that perhaps, don't necessarily have, all that amazing education? Do you think, for people perhaps that are a bit like yourself, what would be your advice for them? If you could give them a couple of words of advice moving into this industry, if you're someone that's passionate, perhaps doesn't have all the arsenal of education or an MW behind them, what's your advice for them to be successful in this industry?
Well, enthusiasm, and enthusiasm. I think if people come and, they're prepared to work hard and they love what they do and they're prepared to, judge and get involved. So I think that, I love enthusiastic people. But I also realise that you can only go so far being just enthusiastic. So if you do have the opportunity to do WSET, or you've got the opportunity to, wine judge, or you've got the ability to, you need some form of education to support your enthusiasm. Otherwise, you'll just be enthusiastic. and less so as less opportunities.
Exactly. That is, I think fantastic advice. And, if I think about the people I want to be around at a wine show or around a table having a glass, it's somebody that brings, like you said, positivity and engagement and passion into the room. And they're people that I think always add value, very much so for someone too that can then has some worth and value in terms of what they're saying. But I think that's amazing advice. So the only other question I have for you, which is not true, I've actually got about 60 more questions, but we might have to leave that for another time. Michael, if you could only drink 3 beverages for the rest of your life, what would they be and why?
Do they have alcohol in them?
Yes, I think so. I mean, you can't tell me tea and water.
Look, I as much as I love spirits, I actually do love spirits. I think that's a whole, Aladdin's cave of temptation. But I just find that, I'm less good drinking spirits. So I'm probably not going to drink spirits. So if it's me, it's probably champagne. And I would probably say Blanc de Blanc. I just absolutely love the Chardonnay, particularly when they age. So it'd be, do you want brands or do you just want styles?
Whatever you like.
Look, if I was drinking Charles Heidsieck Blanc de Millénaire and Comte de Champagne and some of the great Blanc de Blancs going forward, I'd be pretty happy. That'd keep me happy. I think as far as sort of non sort of table wine, non-sparkling, probably Campari. I think that whole that whole world of aromatics. I just think it's such a great drink. Fabulous colour. Love the sweetness. Love the bitterness. Love the just think it's a terrific drink. And I'd also include that other vermouths and things like that. I just think it's a great category, and it's a bit more gentle on you than spirits. Mm-hmm. And then finally, great Pinot Noir. Doesn't have to come from Burgundy, but probably most of it, probably if on my desert island or my death row menu, it's probably Burgundy, but I'd be just as excited by what's happening with Pinot Noir in other parts of the world.
Very, very good options. And let's face it, it's your dream, so money doesn't come into it, so you're allowed to, think big. Michael, I love chatting to you. I mean, you have such an amazing way of telling a story. You are so engaging in real life, but also over a podcast too. So thank you for making the time. You're incredibly busy. I hope our paths cross soon. And thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Cheers.
Cheers to you.
This is Over a Glass. I'm Shanteh Wale. Stay tuned for more stories from the world of wine and drinks. Listen in every Thursday on your podcast app. Follow us on Instagram @overaglasspod and contact us at overaglass@deepintheweeds.com.au.